Well, yes, except I can't work this, so you have to come over here, because it's only been 2 years.
I know it's been 4 for me.
Okay, good.
You're good.
Well, can't. Oh, this one. Okay, good, Sandy, thanks.
Okay, we're good.
The light was on, I couldn't see you. See your microphone.
It's better, though, because I shut those.
Keep using that excuse.
Okay, this official meeting. Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. Record of attendance, Linda. Any declarations of conflict of interest? Any additions or deletions? Go ahead, CAO.
Thank you. So what we're going to do this morning is begin the process of trying to develop a response for council to the Provincial Municipal Fiscal Review Report. And the way I propose...
I can't hear you.
The way I propose to do that, thank you for mentioning that, and if I get too quiet, wave at me, throw something at me. Okay. The way I propose to help you develop your response, I did circulate a draft response, and what I propose to do this morning is walk through the 43 recommendations and have a discussion about what my opinion is about those recommendations, and ultimately what we need to get to is what your opinion is, because the province and UNSM do not want my opinion, they want your opinion. But my job, as I see it, is to give you some advice on these recommendations from the town perspective. So we good with that? Okay, the 33-page response that I sent out, I'm not going to read that this morning, but that is, I know, that is the basis of the presentation. I have also not made this document public intentionally, because what needs to be clear at the end of the process is what your response is to fiscal review, and I really don't want 2 documents out there. So if at the end of the day you support what's in this document, if that's your choice, then we'll make the final version of the document public. If you support some and not other parts, we'll edit the document, and that will be the final, that will be your opinion on paper that will then be public. So in the draft phase, I've just chosen to not make it public, but again, that is that's your call. But my initial perspective was let's not make the document public until it is in fact your opinion.
Great.
Ready to go?
Good to go.
Okay.
So in the meantime, if I'm not catching anyone's light, just shout, because I'll be focused on that.
Yeah, and interrupt me as often as you need to understand any part of this process, because it's going to be fairly long. I doubt we'll get through it this morning, and some of the issues are a little bit complex, and it's important that you understand them. And it has taken me a lot of hours to go through it myself, so I expect there will be some head scratching and questioning of the various recommendations and responses. So let me say that the response that I've prepared for you, I have written entirely from a town perspective. Okay, so there are 3 types of municipalities in Nova Scotia. There are towns, there are rurals, and there are regionals. And I'm not in a position to give you an opinion on the basis of what would be my opinion if I was in a rural municipality or in a regional, but I can provide it to you from a town perspective. And I think it's important that a town perspective be brought forward. That being said, as I've gone through this, I've tried to be fair, and it's easy to fall into the trap of being single-minded and looking after your own interests. In this case, and I've caught myself when I've started to look at numbers and start to think that way, of reminding myself that in fact the goal is fairness, and to step back and try and come up with a recommendation for you that is based on fairness. So let's begin. So the report the report that was online on the UNSM website, and there are several sub-reports and presentation documents that are available. The report was issued in October 2014, just last month. The consultation sessions, of which there were about a half a dozen, were held throughout the province, hosted by the province Department of Municipal Affairs and UNSM. There was one here at the Grand Hotel on October 23rd, and I think anybody who attended that would agree with me is that it was way too much information to try and absorb within a couple of hours. I actually attended myself 3 consultation sessions. I was fortunate at the AMA to be privy to a release of the document just before the public release, and then there was a session in Truro for CAOs and directors of finance to absorb the recommendations as well, so that we could help in advising the councils. So I've had 3 sessions, and even on top of that, there was a lot of time and work spent trying to really understand the recommendations. Council is required, as I've said before, I think I've said before, is council is required to submit 1 response. So what the province wants is not responses from mayors or from councillors. They want 1 response from each council table around the province. Now you can choose not to provide a response, and that's acceptable. But at the end of the day, the reason we're doing it in this way is because you guys have to agree on what your response is to the report, whether it is we like the report, we have no response, or something else. So the deadline for submissions is December 15th. And so what I'm hoping we can do is meet as often and as long as necessary to get you to a position in time for the December council meeting, which I believe is on the 11th or 12th?
It is 11th.
11th. So if we can approve our position at that point, we can tidy it up and make it pretty and send it off to UNSM for December 15th. They will then post all of the responses on their website, and they will forward all the responses to the province. The province will then they'll review, and then they'll refer it back to the working group that was responsible for the report in the first place. From there, I don't know how the province is going to determine what, if anything, they're going to do. I think if I was, and the mayor may have perspective on this, but I think I gathered from the minister at the UNSM conference, he spoke on Friday morning, and there was a question about whether or not there had been sufficient time for this process, this consultation, and his response was he thought 60 days was certainly long enough. I gleaned from his comments that he is looking to make some changes effective for the next fiscal year, so for April 1st. That was my impression, is that he's got a sense of urgency around some of this stuff and wants to see something happen. So in a historical context, you know, the idea of reviewing the provincial and municipal relationship is not something new, and in fact, just if you look at the slide on the screen there have been this is the 6th report in 40 years that's looked at the provincial and municipal relationship, and as you can tell by the dates associated with those reports, they've increased in frequency considerably since 2000, and I think there's a reason for that, and that is that the issues are sort of coming to a head, and the actions that have been taken as a result of the reports have not solved the problem. Right? So we keep doing reports because we do reports, and I have some of them here. The Fair and Equitable Funding Report of 2005, some of the recommendations I've given to you guys have come directly from that report but have not been implemented. There were some recommendations from this report that were in fact actioned under the Memorandum of Understanding that Councillor Mooney will remember, that was in fact cancelled by the government, I think 2 years into implementation. So what that was a freezing of education contributions and a transfer of the responsibility for corrections and housing back to the province. And for fiscal reasons, they cancelled the MOU. So this was, you know, one of the recommendations of many in that report. The town's task force, and these are just the recommendations out of it, there's about half a dozen pages of recommendations. Again, very little's been done on that, but I think the fiscal review report is a result of some of the recommendations in the town's task force report. But the current minister is reviewing, studying these recommendations, and appears intent on making some changes. So I view this as a real key opportunity to have a voice on what direction the relationship is going to take. And you know, I got my reports with me. The Ivany report, right, that came out last year, was an urgent, even said it was urgent in case we didn't get it, an urgent call to action. And I believe at some level the province wants to respond to this appropriately. And I think as municipalities, we have to pay attention and be prepared to take bold steps that will make a difference, not nibble at the edges and hope that the problems go away. Because what I see in the historic context is that's more or less been the approach in the past, and it hasn't made a difference. The issues are becoming greater. It's coming to a head, and so something structural needs to change in the provincial and municipal relationship. So fiscal review. So where did it start? It started with a review of the equalization formula. And we're going to talk about equalization in some depth a little later on. But in general sense, equalization is a subsidy to municipalities who can't afford to provide a standard level of service for a standard tax rate. So there's a formula, and it kind of disperses some provincial money to help municipalities more or less try to be equal. That program isn't working, hasn't worked for some time, and so fiscal review began with everyone agreeing that the program had to be reviewed. The government of the day said, okay, but if we're going to look at equalization, we're going to look at the entire relationship, which I think was a good move. It was a bit of a defensive move, perhaps, because equalization is fully funded by the province. So by throwing everything in the hopper, then you have an opportunity to talk about other ways to more or less balance out the investment. In any case, that's how fiscal review began, and how the scope of it became a review of the entire relationship between municipalities and the province. The way they set it up was a steering committee made up of elected representatives from around the province and deputy ministers. They were the steering committee. They managed the process, and the people who did a lot of the number crunching and working up scenarios and so on to support the work of the steering group was made up of municipal and Department of Municipal Affairs staff. And they did an enormous amount of data gathering and analysis in support of the work that the steering committee was doing. So a lot of people involved, people from towns, from rural municipalities, and from regionals, as well as the province. And in a sense, I think that was one of the unfortunate facts around how the whole thing was done, is that with every interest at the table, certainly there was good debate, but it was good debate at a small table and not in a broader context. So one of the reasons I'm giving you, and I think it's important to give you, a town perspective, is because the town perspective gets lost among the regional, rural, and provincial perspective at that table, and we never actually hear it. Nobody hears it. So we'll put out the town perspective so that the minister and government understands from a town perspective how we see this relationship evolving. That's sort of in the stew of fiscal review, but not clear. So, in their report, they said that they were going to review appropriate funding sources for municipalities, the municipal provincial responsibilities, municipal structure, the impact of regulation on municipalities, municipal grants and contribution structure, and non-financial supports. The recommendations, the 43 recommendations, are broken into 5 categories: improving government structures, improving roads equity, reallocating scarce resources, improving revenue systems, and improving collaboration. So opportunities to improve government structures. And this map, all this map shows is the 54 municipalities Actually, it shows 55 because Canso's still there, but 55 municipalities around the province of Nova Scotia where they're located. And so the next 14 recommendations are all about improving government structures. First recommendation is that the province will formalize the Financial Condition Index tracking as the tool that will be used to monitor the financial health of municipalities. So you'll probably remember in the last 3 rounds of budget deliberations at Town of Yarmouth, that hour that I spend with you talking about statistics. A very small part of that hour is committed to the Financial Condition Index. In that presentation, we talk about Statistics Canada information, we talk about internal information that we have around receivables and so on, and we also throw up the 15 statistics that are the Financial Condition Index. Everybody remember what that looks like? Okay, so in anticipation that that might not be all that clear, all right, I'll just slide down and show you what that looks like. So this presentation is the one that I make at budget time. So these 3 slides, this one and the next 2, are the Financial Condition Index. Okay, so there's a group of revenue indicators, and you remember the color coding, that we're in the green on some, we're in the yellow on some, and in fact we're in the red on some. And so what the province is saying, or what the Fiscal Review Committee is saying in recommendation number 1, oops, where did I lose myself here? Here we are. Too many browsers open. Is that they will formalize the FCI as the tracking tool that will be used to monitor the financial health of municipalities. So the response that I'm proposing to you is that we should agree that the province should track the fiscal health of municipalities. To me, that is obvious. They have plenty of unused data at Department of Municipal Affairs, and that has become abundantly clear to us through this process. I've made several requests to the province for data as I've gone through this, and every time they're able to provide the data very quickly. If you attended the consultation session, you would have seen lots of charts. They have plenty of data. They receive an enormous amount of information from our finance department through the financial information return, which they tell us nobody looks at. They used to actually receive our, no, it's not the financial information return. Yes, it is. Yeah. It is the financial information return. That's our financial statements. Those used to be submitted to DMA, Department of Municipal Affairs, and somebody used to actually look through our financial statements and get back in touch with us with some comments. What did they see? What happens now is the data goes into a database. And I won't say they don't look at it, but nobody is monitoring the fiscal health of municipalities. So they're proposing to use just these 15 indicators, which I think is ignoring a lot of other good data that exists within their department. I think that they should take a broader look at the data available for monitoring fiscal health. The FCI, the Financial Condition Index, was developed as a communication tool. So those of you who weren't around the table back in the day wouldn't maybe have caught this, but the Atlantic Institute of Market Studies, which is a think tank, released a couple of years in a row a report card on municipalities. And what they did is they looked at the available data that they had, which didn't come directly from municipalities, it was secondary data, and they tried to report to the public in the Atlantic provinces how municipalities were doing. And municipalities, as you might imagine, took a little bit of offense to that, feeling that who is this think tank to be evaluating us? They don't have the data, and we think it's flawed. So in response, they set up a working group to establish a financial condition index, and it took a few years to get the thing finalized, but the main point of it was to be able to communicate to the citizens of Atlantic Canada how municipalities were doing. So it's a communications tool. It is not a proven tool for judging or evaluating the fiscal health or fiscal viability of municipalities. So it is not in and of itself perfect. It's not even tested, but it does provide some interesting conversation when you start to look at some of the statistics that it contains. I worked on the working group that came up with the FCI. We talked to people working in municipalities, got some feedback. Some people didn't like some things, and some things were removed, some things are in that people still don't like. At the end of the day, it's to cause discussion, not to create a perfect evaluation tool. So we have a little bit of a problem with it. I have a little bit of a problem with it being identified as the tracking tool to monitor financial health of municipalities.
Did they not treat us differently in this?
That is another issue, is that the town of Yarmouth does things a little bit more progressively, I believe, than other municipalities, in that we fund our amortization. And again, I'll repeat what that means, is that this building is now 20 years old. Every year, you know, 1/40th or 1/50th of its life gets consumed, and that there's an expense to that we record in our books, and everybody is responsible for recording that kind of expense, the amortization. However, the province does not require you to tax for it and therefore to fund it. So we calculate that number for all of our fixed assets, how much of it we use up every year, and it is incorporated into our tax rate, and it goes into our capital reserve, Jerry, and we use it for funding capital projects. So as things get worn out, used up, like fire trucks or sewers, we take the money out of that we have that money to reinvest in our infrastructure. No other municipality in Nova Scotia does that. Everyone budgets something for capital, but no other municipality is fully funding their amortization. And so that creates a little bit of a problem when you're trying to create an index for comparing fiscal outcomes. If they treated us, if they just looked at the way we do things, our situation would look radically different than others. And so then the choice is, do you let it be, do you let us stand out from the others, or do you try and normalize it? And what they did is they normalized it by taking out, basically removing the impact of the funding of amortization from our financial returns, so that they were more in line with everybody else. And we took a bit of offense to that, because we thought, okay, if they're doing that little trick to normalize the data so there's no issue here, what else are they doing for other municipalities when they calculate this thing? And the answer I got back was, well, nothing. This is the only time we're doing something like this. And you know, it's not that I don't believe that, but I think the fact that they're doing it once throws it off. And I think if you're talking about using the FCI to drive public policy, it needs to be compiled and tested and a lot more rigorously than it is if you're just going to use it as a communication tool. Because I can tell you the fact sitting right here that they treat us differently, and we can demonstrate that, and they'll admit that, and that has no impact on anything except our conversation. But when you're using the FCI to drive policy decisions provincially, and you're not calculating it fairly and consistently, well, then the tool is flawed.
So for me, when you set the bar and you're doing something right, and we're trying to get the rest of the province to come up to the bar, you certainly don't lower it to make everybody fit in. That's how I view it, somewhat.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So if you're okay, we'll...
Any questions for number one there? Go ahead, Deputy.
I don't have a question, but I was there with you. I think Sandy and I were there on that day in October, and I was overwhelmed. And but I also realized almost the point that you just made, and then reinforced in your response. I don't know how the department should respond to something like that. You know, why I just get confused. You know. Because we want rural Nova Scotia to be better off in the future. all of rural, not just Yarmouth. Just a comment,
Yeah,
most of the.
so our responsibility, yours and mine, is to look out for the sustainability of the town of Yarmouth. And so we're doing things that we believe are in the long-term best interest of the town. And it is different than what others are doing, and they're not doing those things for their own reasons. And I guess what the province has done here is just a little smoothing of the data, removing the outliers, to make the picture more consistent, and it actually avoids a conversation. The conversation that would have occurred had our FCI been calculated the same as everybody else's would have been, why is Yarmouth so different? And then we could have had the discussion about sustainability, funding your amortization, and so on, but either they didn't want to have that conversation or they thought it would be awkward. I don't know.
Madeline?
First, thank you, Your Worship. Jeff, when did you decide to begin funding our amortization, and why?
Okay, it's in a later slide, but I think about 8
Oh,
years.
all right, no, that's fine.
No, about 8 years ago. The reason why we did it, I'll say we did it in the day. 8 years ago, we weren't even calculating our amortization at that time. But what we were seeing is that our capital list, the list of capital requirements, was far in excess above our capacity. So as a resident of the town of Yarmouth, you'll recall around that time we had a significant increase in your property taxes. And so we increased the property taxes so that we could look after the long-term sustainability of the infrastructure. Okay? So that's where the money went, and we've been doing this. So we started TCA, calculating tangible capital asset and amortization, about 3-4 years ago, Jerry. And at that point, when we did it, we were of the mind, and I guess probably of the belief, that when we started that exercise that we would have to fund it. And I remember when we would talk about it, I was a little bit nervous about what the end was going to come out, because we were already taxing fairly heavily, and I felt if we had to increase our taxation to cover even more, then that would be tough. As it turned out, we were covering it and then some. So ever since then, we've been able to say we rate for our amortization. We cover it with our tax rate every year, and we have for 8 years, even before we knew we were. But we knew the issue. I mean, the issue was obvious, and I think it's obvious to every municipality across Nova Scotia and across Canada, is that their capital lists, the list of capital requirements that they need to meet, they're not able to fund at the current tax rates.
Thank you.
Okay, so recommendation number 2 was that the province and UNSM and AMA will develop materials to ensure that municipalities understand the FCI and have access to best practices to improve their financial health. My response to that is it's important to educate on what it is and what it is not. And recommendation number 1 indicated that it was a valid indicator of financial health of municipalities. I don't think so. I think it's a great conversation tool, and it is part of the picture, but it is not necessarily a great indicator of the financial health of municipalities. It is not all-encompassing, and it has not been tested for its validity or reliability. What is validity and reliability when it comes to statistics? Okay, statistical validity, and there's all kinds of different types of statistical validity, but in simple terms, is the degree to which it measures what it is supposed to measure, right? So we have these statistics, and we put them all together and we say, gee, that gives us a pretty good idea of financial viability. But do we really know that? And so there are statistical tests that you can do to determine the degree to which a measurement is actually valid for what you think you're measuring. And I give an example here. The FCI, the question is, has the FCI been tested to determine that the red indicators are actually, or correlate with, poor fiscal viability? There's been no proof of that. That's a gut feeling. Well, a gut feeling on a statistic that you're going to use to determine the future of municipalities isn't quite good enough. So there needs to be a test of statistical validity. There also needs to be a test of statistical reliability. So reliability is the extent to which a measure gives results that are consistent. And I use a simple example here, your height. We understand that a measuring stick is a valid and reliable measurement of a person's height. We know that you can measure all kinds of people with the same measuring stick, and it will determine how tall they are. Okay? It's reliable and it's valid. We don't know if the FCI is a good measuring stick for financial viability of municipalities. And so what I would say to that is great communication tool. We've had some of the discussions here. But if we are going to use it for driving public policy, then we need to test it. We need to put it through a little more rigor to ensure that it is what they want to use it for. Sorry.
Can I just say one thing? Just something I jotted down under recommendation number 2. It's all right to provide best practices, but there needs to be an accountability measure. That probably as I was reading those, it falls in with some later recommendations. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to say this is what you should do, but that's not good enough. It's sort of like the call to action, and everybody says this is what you should do, but we don't do it. So the accountability measure wasn't there for me in number 2.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when we finish this set of recommendations, it's in there.
Okay.
Am I right?
Yeah, this recommendation is really about providing information.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about
Yeah.
accountability. There's a lot of accountability in this set of recommendations for
Good.
sure.
All right.
Yeah. And I get stuck on the best practices thing a little bit for the same reason I get stuck on the FCI, is that do we know what the best practices are? You know, do we know what the conditions are that predict financial viability? And this is an example I use, but you know, we have the FCI, which is numbers, right, statistics, but nobody's looked at the correlation to say, go back in time and look at the FCI numbers for municipalities 10, 15, 20 years ago. Look at where they are today. Do they actually correlate to the greenness of the indicators 20 years ago correlate to their viability today? What if, for instance, you determined that a municipality's viability is actually correlated more closely to the length of tenure of your CAO? You'd make completely different policy decisions based on that than you would any of those other statistics. And my point is you don't know what correlates closest to success in municipal government over the long term. Okay? It might be that, you know, it could be the length of service of your mayor, right? Maybe if you go through a lot of mayors, you do better. Or maybe if you have mayors for the long haul, the steady hand, right? Who knows? And they don't know. And I guess that's my point, is we know more about the FCI in terms of its reliability and validity for projecting long-term fiscal viability than we do around the tenure of your staff or of your elected representatives related to long-term viability.
Go ahead, Joe.
Jeff, what do you think about situations like Hantsport or Bridgetown? The circumstances they find themselves in. Do you think that has more to be of like a one-trick pony, with Bridgetown being, you know, the old Acadian distillery, or in Hantsport the closing of, you know, they got the gypsum thing there and all that thing that happened?
Those are you know, they both have that in common for sure. They're small towns, small populations. They both used to rely on single or one or two large employers. But I don't know enough about the details of the situations to say unequivocally, you know, this or that is the reason of their demise. Certainly Bridgetown had some fraud, which didn't help.
Yeah.
You know,
It's not helpful.
there are some issues, and we'll get into them. Excuse me, we'll get into them through this report. I have some perspective on why small towns are stressed as much as they are. But let me jump off. I'll jump off on that one right now. back 125 years ago. Our town is almost 125 years old. There was a process of establishing the boundaries for this town, right? Some group of wise people said, we want to form a town out of this municipality, and we established, or they established, where the boundaries would be. I have to believe that when they established those boundaries, the land mass that was within that was viable, right? So they didn't say, we're going to ask the province to incorporate us, and we'll have too small a land mass or too small a tax base to pay for what we want to do. But those boundaries haven't changed in 125 years. But the economy's changed, population's changed a little bit, the services we provide has changed hugely, and yet we are still constrained with those same boundaries. And there's a reason for that, is that every square inch of Nova Scotia is part of one municipality or another. And so if the town of Yarmouth, 20 years after incorporated, decide they actually need more land to pay the bills, more land mass, because it's property tax, there would have been an opposing force to them changing the boundaries, right? And there's opposing forces. Antigonish, 5-10 years ago, went through a protracted battle about annexation, where the town wanted to grab more land, and of course the municipality fought it because it's tax base, it's money. And at the end of the day, nothing changed. They spent about $1 million on litigation over that, and nothing changed. So the boundaries that were set in most towns, it was all around the same time, about 125 years ago, were sustainable then. They're no longer sustainable. Towns have changed, each with their own circumstances, like your Acadian distilleries or whatnot. And so their path into let's say, being non-viable has been different, but we're all kind of on the same path. We're all restricted in our geography, and when that is your reality, you have to make some decisions sometimes that are not easy. And as I said a few minutes ago, 8 years ago, we made some decisions around tax rates that were not easy decisions. And, it's not lost on me that none of those people are around the table today, right? Those were tough decisions, but they were the right decisions on a go-forward basis for the town of Yarmouth. And if you don't make the tough decisions, right, then I think the path is fairly clear, and Bridgetown and Hansport might just be on the leading edge of that.
Thank you. Good.
Linda's noticing I'm choking here.
I thought it was just on your answer.
Oh, .com.
So recommendation number 3 is that the province will develop a suite of programs designed to assist any municipality that chooses or is required to initiate a consolidation process. That's great. The only concern I have about that is that the results from past amalgamations has been somewhat inconsistent. CBRM has not been a model of success. They are still a municipality that has issues. We look at Queens County as a model of success, and HRM, I guess, I don't want to make any suggestion on that because I really don't know. But I haven't heard anybody say they want to go back the old way recently anyway. Programs that are developed, the goals should be clear. And the final point is that they should be fully funded, because there are a number of programs that exist today, like equalization, like the HST rebate, that are not fully funded. And so the goals may have been clear, and they may have been good. In fact, they may have had the right tools, but if they don't fully fund it, then they're probably not going to be successful. Recommendation number 4, after 3 consecutive years of red flagged financial condition indicators exceeding the threshold, municipalities will be subject to a comprehensive review. Okay? So here's where we start to use the FCI to drive policy. What's not clear in that recommendation is whether it's one indicator in the red for 3 years or if it's more. In fact, it is clarified in the discussion of other recommendations. We should agree to a triggered process. I think that's a good thing. I think the reviews are are a great idea in the right circumstance. And I think there should be a trigger. The report discussed different ways of doing it. You could trigger a review by population or other ways. I think a trigger based on some statistical situation is valid. The thresholds that are in the FCI, again, were sort of based on, I'll say, conventional wisdom or what is kind of observed around municipalities generally. Again, there's been no rigor applied to that. Question I have is, the FCI is made up of 15 statistics, and is any one equally valid and reliable as the other? Are they all equal? I mean, that would be an amazing coincidence if you had randomly pulled together 15 statistics and they all are equal, valid, and reliable indicators of something they've never been tested for. And they may actually all be equally valid and reliable and not at all. That I don't think is true, but the point is that any one or any 6, which is actually what the recommendation is, they're saying any 6 of the 15 being in the red would trigger a process. And so I think it's important, if we're going to do that, that we understand that they are valid, reliable, and any 6, that's saying that any one is as good as the other. So you want to discuss that at all?
I just want to make one thing clear. I want to understand one thing.
Yes.
That after 3 consecutive years of red flagged indicators, so if there's 15 over 3 years, there could be 9 different indicators. Are they talking about the same one keeps flashing red?
Okay, so that's a perfect question, because this is one thing that came up in the consultations. You would see a recommendation like this, and Jerry or I or anybody would ask a question just like that.
Yeah.
And the response would be what was intended.
Okay.
Okay? And they would say, well, what we intend is that it would be 6 indicators, the same 6 indicators over 3 years. But what concerns me is that it's not actually in the recommendation that way. It's in the discussion that you discover this stuff. And if you look at what they're doing right now with the FCI was developed in a way that developed a pretty good communication tool, a discussion item, like a coffee table book, but it is not up to the job that they're putting it to now, and that's lost. So if the government were going to accept these recommendations, I think the devil's in the details, and that kind of detail needs to be clear in the recommendation, that it is the same 6 indicators,
Okay.
and it is for over 3-year periods.
Good.
So,
Yeah, that's helpful. And your last line too, the implication that any of them.
yeah, any of them
Right.
equal. You know, I don't think that that's the case. I mean, some of them are completely out of your control.
Yeah.
Not quite completely, but.
Not out of our control, but maybe. Not with you two here. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. It could also be that we could have 2 red indicators, but if we remedied one, that could very, very possibly also at the same time remedy the second one. Because one could be related to the other.
One thing that one of my colleagues had to say at the consultation is that, you know, these indicators, as I said a minute ago, some of them are out of our control, not completely though. We can if the game is that we are going to measure these 15 things, I guess the cliche is what gets measured gets done. Right? So if you're going to measure the success of municipalities based on these 15 indicators, then Jerry and I will be looking at those, and we'll be concerned about those as it relates to council. And so we've talked about ways in which you can turn a red indicator into a green indicator just by how you do your accounting. So they aren't perfect, and you have to be careful what you measure, because you will incent municipalities to take certain policies, certain financial policies, and you've got to be careful that those things are actually what you want them to do. So, for instance, I talked a little bit about the tax rates that we have in the town of Yarmouth, and why they are what they are is about sustainability of infrastructure. But if you look at the FCI, our residential tax burden is slightly above the threshold. Okay, so if we were concerned about getting that indicator into the yellow or into the green, we would lower our tax rates. And so we would be compromising long-term sustainability in order to address the indicator. And so what I'd say to that is that the indicator is the threshold is perhaps wrong. The threshold hasn't considered that nobody except us are undertaking that financial policy, which is truly a sustainable long-term view policy. And so if they agree with that policy, then the indicator is wrong, because I don't know that you can do it within the range that's provided. Now the other factor is that part of that equation is household income, and household incomes in the town of Yarmouth are fairly low. Household incomes in towns generally are lower than rurals generally. Okay, so that's part of the equation there as well. But again, when the FCI was created, it was for conversation. It didn't take a deep dive into what policy decisions would be taken by councils as a result of these numbers. It's for conversation. Carry on.
We good on this one? Yes. Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Beginning on March 31st, 2015, the FCI tracker will be applied as a trigger for reviews for any municipality that has exceeded the red flag trigger threshold for 3 consecutive years. So this recommendation is really just saying what the previous one had, except that it will start March 31st of next year. And again, any subset of 6 are all subsets equal, and I would argue not. And just repeating what I've said previously is that statistics are unproven for predictive validity and reliability. Recommendation number 6, municipalities will be encouraged to voluntarily request a review at any time for any reason. Okay, so voluntarily you could request one of these comprehensive reviews that the province has offered up, or is being proposed, sorry, by the Fiscal Review Committee. Only issue with that is, what do they mean by encouraged?
You know, we're pretty good at that, sitting at this table and saying, you know what, let's take a look. But I don't know that everybody else is. I feel like we are. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think we, at this table, we've done that on a number of issues. Just said, you know what, we need to take a look. Is everything working well? And maybe it's easy to do when you're doing well.
So let me tell you a little bit about the process that's been recommended in the Fiscal Review report. So the process would be that you would agree to this comprehensive review. It isn't entirely clear who would do that, if it would be Department of Municipal Affairs staff, which I guess is fine, except that their staff there's a reduction process underway right now where they have to lose 2 staff in order to replace 1, so they're going to be more stretched under that policy. Would it be people like Jerry or myself being seconded from other municipalities? Would it be retired people or other people working as consultants? And in that case, are you taking the low bid? In any case, you'll be subject to a comprehensive review. The review will provide outcomes that a municipality would be required to, not just one municipality, the subject municipality, but also neighboring municipalities, if they're implicated, would have to agree within 60 days to strategies to which they would undertake to meet those outcomes. Those would be submitted to the minister, and the minister would issue a ministerial order, making them a requirement. Now, it's not clear if the minister's order is obliged to follow the recommendations of the municipalities in terms of process. If those strategies can't be agreed to, the minister has the authority under these set of recommendations to impose strategies to meet the outcomes. But it's not clear how the minister is going to do that, on what advice he's going to be basing his order. So one of the things that I get into in these recommendations is that perhaps it isn't just outcomes that are required in this comprehensive review, but perhaps it's alternatives on process. So if you're going to tell a municipality that you need to reach this point, or you need to meet this threshold, perhaps the consultant or the DMA staff or whoever is involved in the review should provide alternatives for ways to actually achieve it. Otherwise, you may be just setting a municipality up to fail. And 60 days is not a long time. 60 days is a very short time to receive a set of outcomes and be required to assemble the resources you need to come up with good strategy. I mean, you may be in a situation that you just don't have the resources internally to figure that out. In the Town's Task Force report, which was done in 2012, Town's Task Force report actually recommended a commissioner be hired to do this kind of a process, this kind of review, structural review. That recommendation I didn't see clearly addressed in the fiscal review report only 2 years later, and so I guess I had a question of whether or not the commissioner model might be the model that that might work. But again, the question is who is the commissioner, and how are they selected? And you know, there's lots of very capable people in the province of Nova Scotia. My concern would be that it'd be a low bidder, and some of the timelines that are associated with this. Okay. Onward. Recommendation number 17. This is an interesting one. In extraordinary circumstances where it is jointly agreed upon by the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities and the Department of Municipal Affairs that there is a need, a municipality could be targeted for a review process. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how this works. I didn't understand that. Well, I can't understand a scenario where a municipality is not triggered and not voluntary. So how does that, so at UNSM, does the board decide that? Does the board look at the town of Hansport and say, that town needs to be reviewed, and then agree with municipal affairs, and so the town is not volunteering to participate? It's going to be imposed on them by those two bodies. I don't see that practically happening. If there's actually a need, I see a town generally being willing to volunteer. And I can envision even the Department of Municipal Affairs targeting a municipality if they have a council that has their head in the sands and the future is obvious. But I can't imagine the UNSM going along with that, either through a board resolution or from the membership. I don't know that it works, practically speaking. Recommendation number 8. The review will provide all parties with binding outcomes that will identify the conditions necessary for municipal viability. Conditions necessary for municipal viability isn't defined. You know, I'm not sure that everyone really understands what that means. We can all suggest, and we could have a conversation right now about what might be included in those conditions. But it might become a fairly long list. And well, you might include things like a some level of reserves. You might include things like funding your amortization. You might include, gosh, I don't know, tax rates that are within some range. You know, you might include something about your tax base, as Councillor Mooney said, and it's in the FCI actually, is that you can rely too heavily on one business, right? One business closes up, and that can upset the whole apple cart.
So it's different in every municipality. It could be different.
I think some of the elements will be very much the same, but every town, every municipality is different in the makeup, right? In the industries and in the tax base.
Yeah.
And certainly in the tax rates and policies, you know, in some of that stuff that you do, like where you put your priorities, some of that, by adjusting some of that stuff, you may be able to get to viability. So one of the things that Jerry and I talk about is our tax rates and the fact that we're funding our amortization. You look at our residential tax rate, and it's right in the middle among municipalities in the province of Nova Scotia. And so we scratch our heads and say, well, what are the others doing with that money? They're not funding their amortization. So our assumption is that it's being spent on services, right? As I said,
Your assumption is what?
on services.
Okay.
So as I said to council at the last council meeting, we make the decision sometimes to push our staff and to squeeze things quite tightly. And my personal preference is to look after the long-term sustainability of the town, as opposed to provide every service every person wants. So we try to manage service levels that's the expense that comes when we fund our amortization, because you can't have unlimited services and fund your amortization. I don't believe that you'd be able to maintain a reasonable tax rate under the current structures. Okay.
Their year-end numbers would actually tell and indicate where they're spending their money.
For sure. Yeah, that's right.
Because my first thought was, have you asked them? Ask them.
Well,
But then all you have to do is look at their budget.
if I were with the province, I might ask them, because I might be interested. Sitting here looking after the town of Yarmouth, I'm not terribly interested in where they're spending their money. It doesn't affect what we do here. But if I'm with the province and I care about sustainability of infrastructure, that might be an area of inquiry that I look into, comparing costs on services.
Oh, can we go back?
Yes.
Can we go back to the the previous slide and talk about the researcher, the qualified researcher? Would you explain that a little more, please?
Sure. That's just on the comment of the conditions necessary for municipal viability. I don't believe that anybody truly understands what that is. What nobody has put their assumptions to a test, right? The FCI, somebody's made some assumptions about the FCI, but nobody's tested that. And so what I'm saying is, it would be an interesting and perhaps worthwhile and maybe very difficult task, but to have somebody who's actually got the qualifications as a researcher, not as an accountant and not as a policy person, but to go back and look at several municipalities 20 years ago, look at where they are today, and find the correlations, right? What correlates with success? And then you have to test that. Once you identify what the statistics are that correlate with success, you then have to take it and apply it to other municipalities to see if it reliably gives you a good indicator of future financial viability.
Do you have any idea how many qualified researchers we have in this province that could do that task?
We have more universities per capita than any other province in Canada. There's a Department of, or a Masters of Public Administration program at Dalhousie University. I would think that there would be a number of qualified researchers there, and in fact those masters candidates in doing their research to achieve their goals, I think could contribute to that. It's one area of inquiry.
Good.
Recommendation number 9. The reviewed municipality, other affected municipalities, and provincial officials will have, 90 days. I said 60, it's 90 days, to develop an action plan to achieve the outcomes identified in the review. And this is where I said that the review is to provide outcomes and timelines, but it should include process alternatives. It should give the municipality that is under this kind of stress, that may not have the resources to come up with appropriate alternatives, may not have the capacity to lend that capacity through the review process. If somebody has the ability to come up with the proper outcomes, they surely can come up with some alternatives. There is a mediation process recommended in the report around when more than one municipality is involved. There is a process, and it's not bad, but it's not in the recommendation. Again, it comes back to the recommendation is a few words, but the discussion around it adds some richness. And I just think that if they're going to put the recommendations forward, it has to be. It can't just get caught up in these 25 words. There's more to it than that, and that will get lost if it's not clearly part of the recommendation. Because, I mean, they've done it themselves. They've done it themselves. That's a summary of the recommendations, right? So the discussion around those recommendations, mediation processes, and all this stuff is not, it's been detached so that you can just look at the recommendations. And that's my fear when this stuff goes forward. If a government was to adopt this stuff, that they'll lose the details, and the devil's in the details, or maybe the gold is in the details. That more wording needs to be actually put in the recommendations so it doesn't get hived off as easily. Number 10, the province, upon receipt of the action plan, will issue a ministerial order within 30 days. If the province does not receive the action plan within 90 days, the province will issue a ministerial order. Again, I think I've already discussed that it's not clear that the minister is obliged to accept the action plans, nor is it clear how he or she would determine on what basis they would make an order if there were not recommendations forthcoming. Recommendation number 11, municipalities will submit progress reports to the province periodically once the transition process has begun. The FCI tracking will continue. No issue with that. The only issue is the heavy reliance on the FCI. We think it should continue to be tracked, and we think there should be progress reports if you're going to enter a process. Okay.
Yeah, what's periodic? Anyway, you're right, the devil's in the details.
Yep.
There's not many.
And how they support, where is the support, what type, or how, what degree?
Yeah. So recommendation number 12. In the event that a review reveals that the challenges facing a municipality are such that they cannot be addressed through structural changes or a realignment of service standards, or a municipality implements their action plan and improvements are not realized, then a tailored public policy process will be launched.
Public policy process.
I guess the question is CBRM already in that situation? CBRM went through a structural change, an amalgamation 20 years ago, and they continue to have problems that we read about in the Chronicle Herald, and I guess the question is, was simply changing the structure enough? And I would suggest perhaps not. The tailored public policy might be something that we're all headed for at some point in the future if all we do is change boundaries and walk away. There's more that needs to be changed, and more study on the impacts needs to be conducted to determine best practices. Recommendation number 13 doesn't really affect us. It says no new villages will be created and no new powers will be given to villages beyond those that currently exist. Oops.
Deputy?
Jeff, I just had a comment. Over the last 2 or 3 recommendations and response, it may be that staffing will have to be examined as to the qualifications of the staff. And maybe some of these recommendations and the implementation of them will make it very difficult for some of the CAOs and CFOs and other staff and other municipal units. And here we have, and since I've been back for the second time, really so much farther ahead, I think, than we were a long time ago. There's a lot involved to being as a volunteer counselor today, and the in-depth work that you and Jerry are doing in our town of Yarmouth. It's amazing, and I just wonder how the other units, if they got into trouble, you'd have to not just look at the recommendations, but the staffing element too.
Yeah, I think qualifications is very important. I think we're fortunate we have very qualified staff in finance and in other areas, and it is. I have little doubt that qualifications correlate with success. Yeah, it's not the be-all, end-all, right? There are failures that occur when you have qualified people as well.
You challenge us and ask us questions. If you challenge us and ask us questions like you're doing now, that's tremendous. I mean, we learn, and we get questions on the street, as you can appreciate, mostly at the breakfast table, but.
I get some pretty tough questions at the breakfast table too.
Not fair. Hold on.
Yours are a little different though, Jeff, when we leave.
Yes,
How long it's gonna take?
that's
How
right.
come your sister's so slow?
Yeah, that's right. So response number 13, which is about villages, it actually precludes towns. When it says no new villages will be created, it precludes towns from devolving to villages. And that was actually a Towns Task Force recommendation in 2012 that towns be permitted to change their status to being villages. And that was to be studied in the Towns Task Force report. And there was nothing in the fiscal review report that indicated that had actually been studied, but more that it was it was off the table. So I guess that's just a question: is whether or not, if that seemed like a viable alternative 2 years ago, why not now?
So when we send these in, for example, this recommendation, are we stating what we believe should be the response to that? Besides, has there been enough study? As in the extra step, if we're hauling, if we're making bigger pictures, if we're amalgamating, if we're doing all those things, then would our recommendation be that step? Or that villages be put into a neighboring unit? I'm asking if that's what they're after. Is that what we need to put in here?
Are you talking about this specific recommendation?
I'm talking, for example, number 13, no new villages will be created.
Right. I think what's intended here, it seems like in this recommendation, they don't want more villages, and I don't know the intricacies of villages versus rurals, except that they're in rurals.
Yeah.
County of Kings, I believe, has 5 villages within their boundaries.
It's that whole reporting dynamic and everything.
Yeah, I don't know the details of villages.
Okay.
But as I said, my only reflection on that is when I read the town's task force report from 2 years ago, one of the recommendations was that it be studied whether it's a viable alternative for towns to devolve into villages. So pick on the small one. Town of Annapolis Royal is, I believe, under 500 residents. You know, is it an option for them to look at becoming just a village as opposed to being a town? And this recommendation would say no, that they're either a town or they are a community, but they're governed by and serviced by a larger municipality.
Okay.
So the question is whether the study was done, or whether the recommendation of 2 years ago from the town's task force group was it was just determined that it wasn't a direction they wanted to go.
Okay.
So this one is about villages as well. All incorporated villages in Nova Scotia should be phased out. Existing villages should be given the opportunity to apply for town status, merge with an adjacent town, or dissolve into their encompassing rural municipalities as they see fit. And I guess my only comment on that is, it's kind of like as they see fit, where there's the previous 13 or 12 recommendations had all been about rigorous FCI assessments and required triggered reviews, mandatory outcomes, ministerial orders for towns and municipalities. But for villages, the recommendation is as they see fit. And that may be indicative of the fact that there were no village representatives involved in the compilation of this report. And it seems like the direction here is to phase them out, to get rid of villages one way or another. I'm not sure that the as they see fit solution is necessarily the way to go. I think there's another way that might look at viability, how them becoming part of an adjacent town or a town on their own. Viability has to be part of the question. It's just a bit inconsistent with all of the previous dozen recommendations.
Deputy?
Just an observation again, when I was reading it, does it complicate the activity within the DMA, Department of Municipal Affairs, when they have to operate towns, villages, and HRM sort of thing? I think it just, they're an easy way out.
How, for whom? How do you mean?
The operation of they just didn't want to operate or be responsible for administering 3 different operations, a village, a town.
I think what I saw was the municipalities run by these rules, even let's look at roads and things, which we'll touch on later, but municipal units do this, municipalities do this, towns do this. Villages, from what I could see, and I could be wrong, they just get to pick and choose what they do, and the rest falls into the neighboring units. That's probably a very free version of what I saw, but that the rules and regulations are not so tight that if they can't provide something within that village, then the neighboring units provide that service. Is that?
Okay.
Okay.
I really can't say.
All right, either I read it or we yeah.
Well, I just think the only response we can provide on this as a town, because it really does not affect us directly, is that there is some inconsistency in the approach. Right? So if you're going to allow a village to consider becoming a town, there ought to be some rigor around a test they have to meet, a fiscal viability test they have to meet. Otherwise, they may be setting themselves up for failure and another change down the road. That's it. I mean, it doesn't directly affect us. It's just inconsistent.
Okay.
Okay. So those are your 14 structural recommendations.
Okay. Do you want to take 5 minutes, everyone? How long are we going?
As long as you want.
What do y'all think? We're back at 1. Do you want to go till noon? Do you want Linda to bring in something for lunch? Do you want to, what's your pleasure? What do you think? Want to stop,
Water, right? Yeah.
want to stop at noon? We okay to go till noon?
Yeah.
Does anybody need to get up for 5 minutes? Okay, here we're going. Are you good, Jeff?
Oh, I'm
Do
great.
you want me to get you another coffee?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. No, thank you, I'm good.
Gotta look after you.
Thank you, I appreciate your concern. So those are the 14 structural recommendations, and that's how, under fiscal review, they're recommending, I guess, things like dissolutions or amalgamations might be triggered, or simply pulling your socks up. I mean, it's quite possible there's no structural change. It's just maybe policy change that would result from these reviews, and the outcomes and action plans might just simply be changing their fiscal policies. And I guess it's a little bit revealing that they categorize them as structural, when in fact the only changes might be in terms of fiscal policy, internal fiscal policy. I think there's an understanding that there will be structural changes with municipalities in the foreseeable future, and this is putting a mechanism in place that deals with them consistently. Opportunities to improve roads equity.
Woo!
So there's only one recommendation in this area, and it is the only group of recommendations that recognizes that there are inequities between classes of municipalities. If you stop and think about municipalities, towns and rurals, the main difference between us and them is that we have to pay for the maintenance, the construction, and all the equipment required to maintain every bit of our roads. And rural municipalities have to pay for the maintenance of J-class roads. And J-class roads are, as I understand it, subdivisions. So very local subdivisions within the municipality. And I think I'm right in saying that most municipalities simply contract that service from TIR, Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. So the big snow plows that you see out plowing the 101, the 103, and the Route 3 and the Route 1, and all the roads out in the rural areas also plow the roads and fill the potholes in the J-class roads. They just pay an annual service fee based on the number of kilometers they have. So that's the big difference between town and rural. It's probably the reason that we have town and rural caucuses at UNSM, because we're different. That's the primary way that we're different. So we're going to improve roads equity, make us more alike. So the recommendation is that rural municipalities will now be required to pay TIR the full maintenance recovery cost, approximately $6,700 per kilometer, plus annual CPI, for maintenance of the 745 kilometers of local roads maintained under the Service Exchange Agreement. That was back in 1995. If rural municipalities so choose, TIR will also service, at a cost plus capital of approximately $13,500 per kilometer plus CPI, the 138 kilometers of roads that rural municipalities are currently fully responsible for. So out there somewhere, there are 138 kilometers of roads that rural municipalities are actually 100% responsible for. In addition, the province will engage in an education campaign to ensure that all municipalities understand the policies and practices that TIR has in place to trade off roads maintenance responsibilities or ownership where possible, so as to ensure the maximum efficiency. So, so roads equity and fairness. The goal of fiscal review, by the way, is fairness. That's what we're looking for at the end of the day. And fair doesn't mean equal. It means fair.
Exactly.
Okay? It is not an accounting term. It's kind of a political term. It's kind of a warm and fuzzy term in a way. Do we feel good? Do both sides feel good that they've been dealt with fairly? Tell me how this makes you feel. So rural residents pay for roads maintenance, capital improvements, and equipment through their provincial taxes. The province does all the maintenance, except J-class roads, through their provincial taxes.
So do we.
Town residents also pay those taxes. Plus, through our property taxes, we pay for road maintenance, capital improvements, and equipment in town through property taxes. So you wonder why the property taxes in towns generally are higher than the property taxes in rurals. It's because we have an extra burden. We have all those roads, not just maintenance, maintenance and capital. And through your income taxes and your HST, you're contributing just as much as a resident in a rural municipality to the maintenance of their roads. That is the biggest difference that exists between towns and rural municipalities, and there's an opportunity to fix it. We recommend, I say we, that's up to you. That's up to you. I recommend you consider, in the spirit of fairness, the province require rural municipalities to take over financial responsibility for all local roads within their boundaries, while allowing or requiring them to continue to contract the service from the province, from Nova Scotia Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. So information-wise, the cost for that annually, based on the fiscal review report, is $145,790. And that maintains 15,036 kilometers of local roads. Now remember, there's 136 kilometers, I think it was, or 138? Yeah, 138 kilometers that they are right now currently fully responsible for, somewhere, out of the 15,036.
What do we got in the town of Yarmouth, Jeff, for our story, your worship?
Oh, it's in
What do we got, about 60 kilometers?
72.
72, yeah.
Their number, and this, you have to remember this as well, or be
that
aware
was
of
in
this, is that the numbers, this 15,036 is not right. I can guarantee you it's not right, but it is the number that is used in the fiscal review report, and for the sake of data accuracy, use it. Update it over time, but use it as the basis today. They say we have 60 kilometers, we actually have 72 kilometers in the town of Yarmouth. Okay?
So when you, on this chart here, you've got 335 kilometers of local roads. That's for TIR.
You're looking at the report.
I'm looking at your recommendations, right? That's municipality. I might have just,
Sorry, yeah, I know.
okay. Sorry, Jeff, that's
Sorry, that is the
municipal,
municipality of Yarmouth.
okay.
Yeah. So based on TIR's current inventory, the municipality of Yarmouth, not the town of Yarmouth,
Yeah.
has 335 kilometers of local roads. Okay? So what I'm saying is, these are the best statistics available.
Okay.
So we use them for the purposes of analysis. And I do some analysis, and I'll go through that here. So what about the $82 million? So go back here. So we're going to recommend that rural municipalities pay the province $82 million for the purpose of maintaining their roads. So where does the $82 million go? I recommend you consider recommending that the $82 million collected through road service contracts be applied against the education amounts charged to municipalities, which amounts to $214,901,313, and that education charges to municipalities be capped and frozen at the reduced level until further means of reduction are identified. So this has consistently been a concern of municipalities, that we are charged, in the case of the town of Yarmouth, $1.6 to $2 million, somewhere in that range, for education. It's a transfer. We collect it on property tax and we transfer it to the school board. And that is a constant issue with all municipalities across the province. So the total amount of that transfer is $214 million. I'm saying make the roads thing equal between rurals and towns, take that money and apply it against the $214 million. Reduce the transfer from municipal government to the province for education. So it's a zero-sum game. So why would we do this? Because roads divide us at the UNSM. Roads make it difficult for the Union of Nova Scotia municipalities to have a consistent point of view on issues whenever roads are on the table. Education transfer has been a long-standing issue for excuse me, for all municipalities. And with this recommendation, or two recommendations, you can make a difference on two important issues. So what about tax rates? One of the first things that you think is, if you're going to put $82 million on the backs of rural taxpayers, what's that going to do to the tax rates? So currently, the average town residential tax rate is 78% higher than the average rural tax rate. And this is using residential rates, okay? 78% higher if you live in a town than in a rural municipality. Changes to roads and education could allow towns to decrease the residential tax rates an average of 6.7%. Proposed changes in roads and education could increase rural tax rates by an average of 24.9%.
Wow.
The gap between residential tax rates could be decreased to as low as 33%. So think in terms of our local circumstance. The tax rates between the town of Yarmouth and the municipality of Yarmouth and municipality of Argyle, thinking residential only at this point, could be decreased to a 33% gap from a 78% gap. Okay, not equal, but fair.
Fair.
We can't afford that, they might say, right? Two things, before I get into this chart, I want to say,
I was going to say, some of these are the comments that we heard at the meetings from the rurals when these types of discussions happen. We just can't afford it, those types of things, so that's why Jeff's addressing it.
yeah, that's one of the things about the consultations is you did get to hear what other people were saying and did get to ask questions and hear responses. So when I asked the question about roads, there were a couple of immediate responses that I heard. And so one of them is that we can't afford it. Now I want to go back again eight years when the town of Yarmouth imposed a rather significant tax increase on its residents. It was about a 25-cent increase on the tax rate. That's not quite 25%, but it was 25 cents on the tax rate. That was for infrastructure. That was because no, you're thinking of a different levy. This was on the general tax rate, and that was done because we were taking money out of reserve to pay the operating expense, and we had nothing for capital. And the infrastructure in the town was failing. There were things that needed to be done. We did a debt affordability analysis and realized that we couldn't fund our future on debt, and so we made a decision. Council supported a decision to increase the tax rate, basically 25% on residential as well as commercial. So, one of the things that we hear from rurals, some rural people, is that we can't afford that kind of an increase. So what I did is I looked at the average household income according to Statistics Canada for towns and for rurals and for regionals. And as you can see from this slide, the average household income in towns is lower than either municipals or regionals. And remember, what I said earlier is that the average tax rate in rurals is lower, 78% lower than in towns. The residential tax effort, according to the FCI, which combines those two things, 3.3% of household income in towns goes to pay property taxes, 1.9% in rurals. So can they afford it? Yes, they can afford it.
Thank you. The town's average, roughly by what percentage would that number change if we did, if the majority of the residents in town all received, did not receive government assistance? Do you have any idea, roughly?
No, no idea.
No?
Yeah, no, I don't have any statistics on that. So therefore, my conclusion is that taxpayers living in rural municipalities that would be impacted by these policy recommendations are able to afford the resulting tax increases better than residents in towns are able to afford their current service burdens. Okay?
And Jeff, this is not only a problem that we're having in the town of Yarmouth, this has got to be right across the province, right? It's got to be right across, you know, you talk about we're subsidizing, basically what you're doing is subsidizing people that live in the municipality, not only if it's in Yarmouth, if it's in Spring Hill. What about, so I pay for the roads that are in Carlton as much as I pay for the roads that are on Porter Street or the roads that are on...
No, no.
More.
Pay double.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're paying more for the towns in road, the roads in town, because you're paying for capital as well as maintenance, I guess. Yeah, you're paying for it in the municipality too. They're paying less because you're helping them. You're paying 100% of your burden in town, and you're paying your full share out in the rural municipalities.
Well, geez, we might have to do what they do at the hospital. We might have to set up a toll booth at Main Street and Main Street, and at whatchamacallit, charge everybody $2 that comes into the town of Yarmouth and put their money right back into our roads.
Well, it doesn't feel very fair, does it? And that's
No,
why.
especially when you know, and you get it all the time. Jim said he gets it at the breakfast table when you go over to the Grand Hotel, and you get it. You get it all the time, is you always get the crack, I can't afford to live in town. And you get all the time, I can't afford to live in town, but one of our major expenses, and then they complain about the roads, right? And you kind of explain it to them, and they kind of like sometimes, like, you know, sometimes when we're talking around him, kind of get a little glazed over look. But we're subsidizing people that live in the municipality, especially on the outskirts, right? When you talk about roads, and well, when you're going to pave Prospect Street, I said, Prospect Street's only half ours, right? When you're going to talk to the provincial government or your municipality about coming in and helping out, doing some of these things, but especially people that are close, and I think that's one of the problems that they're having in HRM about, especially I think it was municipal infrastructure and recreation. I think they just kind of almost got that thing solved, that it's all absorbed in the general rate because they're charging area rates here just until this fiscal year coming up. But it's a discussion that you have with people all the time about the inequities of disparities of the tax rate between here and the municipality. And I think this is the biggest reason. If we can get past this hurdle with these recommendations going back, I think that's going to be not only a help to us, but everybody right across the province. And like, you got to lower that gap, right? Because you looked at the chart there where you had you know, household income in the town of Yarmouth. Well, we have, you know, Churchill Manor, we have Beacon Street, we have Trinity Place, we have Trask Avenue, we have Mountain View Manor. You know, we have all those seniors that come in here that have a stable income, but, you know, we got to get people, besides that, we have to get people that are working, moving back here in the town of Yarmouth. And I think now that the price of gas is going down, people might look at it different, but if that thing goes back up to $110 or $120 a barrel, driving from here to Carlton, or here to Kemp, or here to, Pleasant Valley, or here to Pinckney's Point, or here to Melbourne, or here to Pubnico, living in town of Yarmouth looks pretty attractive when you're spending a lot of your disposable income on gas. And the other part is all that taxation component goes right back to the provincial government and the health fund anyways. It's a long, you know the story way better than I do, and I know Jim and Danny and everybody else around the table has the same feelings, because when you're out on the street, that's what you hear about, the disparity in the tax rate. And this is the major reason.
Deputy?
Again, just a comment, Jeff, of support your response, sort of made it black and white. What does this do to our relationship with Kenny and Ellen and the two wardens when you meet monthly? Because I'm definitely supportive of everything so far. And so you got to sit around the table in the back, in the room there, or wherever you meet, and say, boys, how about it?
I guess my response to that is, I'll go right back to where I started, is I'm giving you a town perspective. I can't represent the rural perspective. Doesn't feel fair. And I think they need to respect the fact that I think they will as well. I mean, we have 30 towns in the province of Nova Scotia. Several of them are struggling. Something is wrong. Something needs to change. And if we're not willing to consider alternatives, then nothing will change. And this is just a point of view. It's one option. I think it needs to be presented. I say that. You guys don't need to agree. You can say, no, thank you very much. Put that one back in the box. But I'm putting it forward to you because I think it is one way of helping to restructure the financial relationship between us and the province, as well as us and our neighboring municipalities, that might set us on a course of better viability.
Go ahead. I hope not. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. Jeff, I read the report just now, this morning. I was up to number 15 and just going beyond as you were going through that, so it just was a hit of you. And you spent a lot of time on this, you and your staff, I would take. I don't know how much the staff played a role, but I'm sure they played some. It's excellent. I mean, it's bang right on. It really is. And I thank you for being so prudent on it, and you had a real hard look at it, and you know the statistics, and you know the facts, and you know the figures, and it shows that you gave it a lot of thought, but through your experience as being the CEO over the years, you know the goings-on that's been going on provincially with different governments, and it shows in your report. I sat around the table, as some of my colleagues sat around the table previously, and was privy to some of the information and what was going on with the provinces, how they would download on us. This here is it is an eye-opener, especially when you got all the numbers right here that shows the difference and like my colleague Councillor Mooney has said about the difference between taxation. And you do hear it a lot. It's too expensive to live in the town of Yarmouth. And you know what? There's a lot of truth to that. It is. And you show it right here. And I've always said, it's more expensive to live here because of what we offer for being here. And I never really gave it a lot of thought till you just showed it in these facts and figures. There is a big difference. And the difference has to be really addressed. And the province, I hope, looks favorably onto the recommendations that you're suggesting that we send in. I'm in full agreement, but one of my main questions is, this report that you've done, are these recommendations are your thought that the town council should send forth to the province? I solely agree. Up to what I've read now, I'd like to be able to read even further into this, in all fairness to you. But I can see that you've done a lot of hard work, and I keep saying it because you have. And I think, well, matter of fact, I know that these are the recommendations that I would, not writing them down, and I thank you for writing them down, should go forward up to the 15th chapter here. So I thank you again, you and your staff, and it's really good reading, and it's a real eye-opener. And you were right, it's a lot to take in, but I'm glad that you took the time to do the recommendations also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Dawes?
Thank you, Your Worship. Referring back to your recommendation, Jeff, how many of Yarmouths are in the mix, or do we stand there alone with that are in the same position as we are?
Sorry, can you just repeat that, please?
Are we alone in the position that you've shown us?
Okay.
Or are you? No, answer that
I haven't
question first.
consulted with the other towns. I haven't consulted with the rurals.
So there may be more than just us.
What I'm giving you is what I believe is a town perspective. Looking at these recommendations, it's not just a town perspective though, but I can't pretend to represent the rural perspective. I haven't talked to the other towns to know what they're submitting. I haven't talked to the rurals beyond the consultation sessions to know what they're thinking. So this was done somewhat in isolation.
I'm just asking because, we are unique. We're size-wise.
Okay.
We're number 3.
No, we're number 5. We're the 5th largest town in Nova Scotia out of 30.
So we're not in the majority.
No. We are not in difficulty right now financially, but we are in the top 5 in terms of size, and so by population, and so I think that gives us a little bit of strength as a town, but we can't be complacent. We can't just leave it to the others because they're stressed, and we know if nothing changes, and nothing has changed recently, that we're probably headed in the same direction they're headed, ultimately. Same direction that the smaller towns are headed in. Something needs to change.
Thank you.
People say it is expensive to live in the town of Yarmouth, and it is true that our tax rates are higher than the municipality. But as I said to you earlier, the residential tax rate in the town of Yarmouth is right in the middle. When it comes to towns in Nova Scotia, out of 30, we're right in the middle. Okay, it is expensive to live in the province of Nova Scotia, but we truly don't know how expensive because we're not paying the bills. Right? The province is running a deficit. The province has a significant debt. In the town of Yarmouth, we have, I think, the 4th lowest debt servicing costs of any of the 30 towns. We pay our way, and the province of Nova Scotia has not for a long time paid its way, and neither is our federal government. And so people are not realizing how expensive it is to live, but I can tell you that in the town of Yarmouth, as a municipal government, your residents are feeling the full cost, and it is well within the range of what all town residents are paying across the province.
Councillor McIsaac?
Thank you, Your Worship. Jeff, would it be fair to say that pretty much all the towns in Nova Scotia are pretty much in the same boat that we are? I mean, as far as responsibilities go for their infrastructure, their roads, and their, sidewalks, and municipal units are different because they have a province funding for roads and J roads and all the other good stuff. So pretty much all the towns would be in this pretty much the same boat. And if they had these recommendations in front of them like we have today, I dare say that they would give 2 thumbs up for this report.
I expect so. But let me just throw this out. Yes, the answer to your question is yes, they have the same responsibilities we do. We have some added burdens that we carry. We have an airport that we support that not every town has.
Yeah, that's right. I
We
mean,
have-
putting aside that,
Yep.
yeah,
But all the same required burdens. for
that's
sure.
right. I understand that. Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Mooney.
Yeah, and hopefully that, just to echo what Councilor McIsaac said, not that we use that word echo around here a
No,
lot.
don't use that
We
anymore,
don't.
no rants or echoes.
Hopefully every other municipal unit's doing this exercise, right? And that's what we can hope for, so hopefully all, huh? Well, yeah, I think they're gonna be, I don't think any one of the 30 towns is gonna have any different view on some of these recommendations than what our CAO has put forward for us to look at, especially when it comes to the inequity in the road part. That's, and we keep saying it here time and time again, and every time you go to UNSM or FCM, is we own, municipal units own 60% of the infrastructure, so a lot of that's going to be in towns or cities, and we only collect 6 to 8% of the taxation money. We own 60% of the infrastructure. I talked to a friend of mine that lives on he doesn't live on a J-class road, but he lives on a provincial road, but there's a J-class just down from his house, and they have problems with plowing and other things here in the town of Yarmouth. We do a great job with what we have to work with for clearing our roads, and the money that we put back into ourselves, I think we do a great job. There's always got to be, you keep going on, Councillor McIsaac, about the state of some of our roads, but I think for the amount of money that we put into it, we're doing a good job, and this is going to help. If this gets through, if we can get it on the minister's desk. If it doesn't go on the shelf along with the other stuff, this is a start, right? So, anyways, keep saying the same thing. I keep echoing myself.
I could be way off base. I don't think this one's going on the shelf. I just get that distinct.
I hope not.
I hope not too. And when it comes to the different towns, are they thinking like this? My question is, did they pick up that now or never report? Because I've watched the CAO in his office with that in his hand, pacing back and forth. You lose sleep over it because you take it seriously. So you put everything into this. So I'm just glad all this stuff that we're putting on is going to go up on that website, so the rest of the towns can read it. So go ahead.
Okay. So I talked about that slide. And that
You're allowed to send this recommendation in bold and in 50 font.
Okay. So one of the other comments that I heard when I was talking about roads, I asked a simple question: why this scenario was not even considered in the report? There's a one of these reports. Sorry? No, the fiscal review committee did not look specifically. They didn't look specifically in their draft options. They didn't look at the option that I put on the table here, and I asked the question, why not? And one of the responses that I quickly got from a rural representative was, we didn't build those roads. The province went willy-nilly building roads all over the place. We can't take on those roads. Well, interesting fact is on the mayor's office, there's a big picture of the town of Yarmouth from 1879, the year before 1889, the year before the town of Yarmouth was incorporated. And so I asked our mapping technician to look at that picture, and she has other sources of data as well, and tell me what percentage of the town's roads existed before we incorporated. And it was 82.2% of the roads that currently exist in the town of Yarmouth existed 125 years ago. Maybe not in the same condition, but they existed. So we didn't build those roads either.
You didn't hear what Danny said?
No.
Yeah, Jim was there.
Oh, you guys are a hard crew.
Sorry? Yeah, some of them. So this
Jeff, we owned our old paving plant in town of Yarmouth?
I don't remember. I mean,
Jim remembers that, don't you, Jim? Town of
Gee,
Yarmouth
don't
owned
I
our old
remember
paving
that, don't
plant.
I?
He used to own it.
So the recommendation does not, this recommendation doesn't equalize the road burden, because the capital piece, we're not suggesting that that be put on the burdens of the rurals as well at this time. But it does make it more fair, and I guess the question to you folks is, does it make it sufficiently fair? If you were to add the capital burden based on the numbers that TIR gave to the Fiscal Review Committee, you would double that $82 million burden to become more like a $160 million burden. And I think that would be a 50% increase in their tax rates. And in fact, your rural taxes might be higher than your town taxes. So my recommendation is based on the maintenance costs only, deal with the 82 million. If that were to be adopted, I think we would have overachieved.
Yeah.
So based on your definition of fairness, that's not going to happen. Everybody's not going to have a warm, fuzzy feeling over this.
Oh, no, no.
But fair is fair. It's the right thing to do, I guess,
Right.
is a way to frame it. What'd
So-
you say, Jerry? Fair's not equal, exactly.
Right, fair is not equal. I actually saw that. I told
Nice to
Jerry I
be
saw
more
that.
equal.
I was in the gymnasium at Meadowfield School, and my son was doing his basketball practice and walking around, and the phys ed teacher has on her window, fair does not mean equal. And I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, fair does not mean equal.
Yeah.
So conclusions, it is feasible to transfer the costs of local roads to rural municipalities as long as the savings are applied to education costs levied against municipalities. So that's a key piece, is rural municipalities pay education just like towns do. And so the 82 million, I took that in my analysis and applied it against the education. So they wouldn't actually be paying the full 82, they'd be paying a portion of that because they'd be getting back on the education relief. So it's a zero-sum game for the province, and it's less than an $82 million impact on the rurals, and some of it comes into the town as well. You could actually make the argument, if you wanted to, no statistics on this, but because they're not taking on the capital costs of their roads, that is being shared by town residents. And so some of that dividend coming back in on the education costs helps reduce the burden on town residents, maybe close to enough to offset the capital cost.
Well, it would be, in a perfect world, there would be more Yarmouths out in the province who would support your recommendations, and there would be a louder, more unified voice.
So even if these recommendations are adopted, the average tax rates in towns remain substantially higher than rurals, not as much as it is now. Benefits, as we address the service responsibility discrepancy that has existed for over 100 years between towns and municipalities. We have a more cohesive UNSM, as municipal responsibilities are more consistent between towns and rurals.
That's a big deal. It
And we
is.
begin to address UNSM's long-standing issue with the education transfer. Potential narrowing of tax rates between towns and rurals will reduce the incentive for sprawl and could lead to higher density development. And again, from a sustainability perspective, higher density development is better.
And that's what they're, Your Worship,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
and that's what the city of Halifax is looking at right now.
Everybody
Right.
is. Yeah.
Why resurface, building new subdivision, building new, building new ones when you already have the infrastructure and the water, the sewer to existing properties, so why would you go reinvent the wheel? That's, a major portion of the cost of those things.
So it's a greater level of fairness without any new money from the province. So we also recommend, or I recommend, you recommend, is a governance/consultation mechanism be developed to provide for meaningful input and feedback from the municipalities who will be paying for road maintenance to the provincial service provider. So currently, I don't think there's any formal mechanism for the municipality of Argyll to provide input and receive information from TIR. But if they're going to pay the full shot of maintenance, then obviously there needs to be some mechanism put in place to provide some accountability. Next group of recommendations, if we're done with that one, I'm done with that one, unless you have questions.
Should it be scarce?
Scare resources. Scare, this Halloween theme. Sorry about that. Scarce resources.
Okay.
So recommendation number 16. So I'm going to read through this, and then I'm going to get into, yeah. So the group recognizes that the fundamental purpose of equalization still stands. However, there are identified issues with the equalization grant in its current form. Specifically, it discourages restructuring and does not always allocate funds to municipalities with the greatest needs, as identified by other financial measures. As such, it is recommended that the equalization program be frozen at 2014 levels to allow time for an alternative equalization grant to be developed based on improved data. And it talks about such as well, consideration should be given to the standard service levels used to determine the municipal need. The approved operating grant to start in 2018 will better address the needs of municipalities and encourages the outcomes necessary to ensuring Nova Scotia municipalities remain viable. Similarly, the town's foundation grant would be frozen at its current distribution, regardless of structural change, and then be re-examined as part of the improved operating grant structure. So it's not working, it's ineffective, don't change it for 3 years, and remember, equalization was the reason fiscal review began. Fiscal review began as an examination of the equalization formula. That was 3 years ago. Today the recommendation is we can't sort it out, 3 more years. Freeze it. So what is equalization? Sorry. So what is equalization? Basic idea is that every municipality should be able to maintain a basic level of service at a reasonable level of taxation. And there's a formula. And it's basically what is your need minus your ability to pay determines your grant. Except 54.39% is in 2010-11 the degree to which the province funded the program. So if our need was 10 million and our ability to pay was 7 million, we should get 3 million. But then it would get multiplied by 54.39% and we'd get roughly half of that because equalization is not fully funded. The $50,000 on the end there, that is the what they call that? They call that the town's foundation grant. So they take $1.5 million and spread it out to the 30 towns in equal bags of $50,000. And it's just a town foundation grant.
So this ability to pay thing,
Yep.
tell me if I'm off base, but I have a hard time with it because when we talk fairness on one hand and ability to pay on the other, you get less money because you do things right, so your books look good. That just doesn't sit right with me.
Okay,
and I can't apologize for doing it right.
That's the problem with subsidies.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Yeah.
So I want to talk about what's wrong with all that, and it's in here, the subsidy
Yes.
thing. So equalization, the first comment in the recommendation was, the group recognizes the fundamental purpose of equalization still stands. It resonates, right? We should all be equal. We should all be fair, right? It sounds good. Okay, but how they do it is the devil's in the details. The formula is flawed. Everybody recognizes, that equalization doesn't work. Now, equalization, I should say, started with the Graham Commission in 1975, in that 74. In that report, that's where equalization came from. Prior to that, what happened was the province would do emergency funding. So if a town was struggling or a municipality was struggling, had some financial crisis, the province would almost arbitrarily, I suppose, write a check. There was no formula, no program, they'd write a check. The Graham Commission said there ought to be a program. Now, I didn't read the Graham Commission report, so I can't tell you if they I know.
I got a copy of it.
I can't tell you if they laid out what the formula is, but basically the formula goes like this. They look at the a set of expenditures, and they include things like fire, police, and one or two other things, for all municipalities in a class. So it'd be all towns or all rurals.
Okay.
And they look at how much that costs, and they average it. And then they divide it by residential units. And they say, you multiply your number of residential units times the average cost of those services per residential unit, and that is your need. So I asked the question, is it actually true that residential units drive service costs? And the answer is no. But that's the formula, right? So the formula is flawed in that regard. What it does on the other side is it takes all of the uniform assessment for all of those towns, adds it all up, figures out what the tax rate would have to be to pay for all of those needs. Then it takes your actual uniform assessment and multiplies it by that average tax rate, and that's your ability to pay. So the difference between your need and your ability to pay is how much grant you get. The formula is flawed. Everybody recognizes that. Nobody believes it should continue. But in the absence of a better alternative, and they looked at all kinds of things, the fiscal review did, they came up with leave it alone.
I'm sorry, and this has been in practice since when?
The equalization came in around 1980, but it was a recommendation of the Graham Commission around 1974 or 75, 40 years ago.
My father was Minister of Municipal Affairs when the Graham Commission came in.
There you go. Even if the formula worked, and even if the results of equalization was that it actually led to fiscal viability, it was actually the right thing to do and the right way to do it, it's not fully funded. It's only about 50% funded. So it would not be successful even if it was set up for success. And I'm saying it's not set up for success, and it's not fully funded, so it is flawed and it needs to go. The other thing about it is it's a subsidy. And what was said here a few minutes ago is that the better you do, the less you get. Well, that's the way subsidies work, right? It does not motivate you to do better, right? So in the recommendation there, it talked about that the equalization should continue even if there's structural change, because what would happen tomorrow if the town of Yarmouth dissolved or amalgamated with the municipality of Yarmouth? We would be, the equalization formula would be the rural formula, because we wouldn't be the full county. We're not big enough for it to be a regional by definition. So we would receive less subsidy. Well, it's a disincentive to structural change. A subsidy is a disincentive to doing anything right. So the recommendation that I'm going to get to is to replace it with an incentive program that rewards you for good decisions, good governance, good fiscal practices, as opposed to subsidizing municipalities.
Phil was just mentioning the nursing homes, all those nursing homes. Is that formula in there? Because we have so many, and they're only counted as
right. So
one.
So one of the I asked the question, what is a residential unit? Because we do have like the meadows and boarding houses, and how are those calculated and those are all one dwelling unit. And the reason is that the definition of a dwelling unit is that it actually includes a kind of a kitchen. The ability to cook and prepare meals, has to have its own bathroom, has to have its own sleeping area. So those three elements are what create a dwelling unit. In the meadows, the residents don't have their own cooking area. So all those 120, 110, 120 residents are all within one dwelling unit, according to the formula.
Go ahead. The light works better than the hand.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you, Your Worship. If there were two kitchens, would they then be classed as a double unit or two succinctly different units?
No, if you have two kitchens in a single-family dwelling, one upstairs, one downstairs, you're still one dwelling unit.
I thought that
No,
qualified as two.
To create two, I think you have to have your own entrance, maybe, like separate entrances or something. I didn't look into it that far. My question really was, how many at the Meadows?
Yes.
One. How many at the seniors boarding homes that we were getting more? One.
One.
And so what I did is I looked at, to understand how flawed this was, I looked at the amounts of money that different towns are getting, and I just couldn't fathom it. I couldn't figure it out. And so I started asking questions, and the more questions I asked, the more deeply I realized how flawed the formula is.
I'm surprised that they are categorized as residential and not institutional.
They probably are, but they ought to be. They're not taxed, first of all.
No,
The Meadows isn't taxed under a private
which
member's bill.
already kind of
Right, but
balances it.
But it would be considered a commercial, it would be assessed commercial. There's only two types of assessment, right? It's
Residential.
residential or commercial. Yeah,
Okay, I'm back on.
okay? So, I'm recommending that you consider equalization program be phased out of existence over 3 years, rather than cold turkey, phase it out over 3 years. Recommend that an incentive-based provincial/municipal program be developed to reward municipalities to achieve valid and reliable financial benchmarks that demonstrate their fiscal viability and good governance. And this goes back to the FCI, the Financial Condition Index. When that project started, the next step was to create governance indicators, right? And they never did phase two. But what I'm saying is that your financial statements or your financial measures need to be in shape to receive some of these incentives, but maybe your governance stuff does too. Your bylaws, your policies, how you make decisions, so on. Whether you have a strategic plan. These kinds of governance things that contribute to long-term viability, the more you do of that, there ought to be an incentive. You ought to be rewarded financially for doing things well. I recommend you consider some of the funds saved through the phasing out of equalization be allocated to support a policy for dealing with surplus schools. Very similar to the Department of Health Continuing Care Branch replaced facility disposal policy. If you recall what that is, so everybody knows what the surplus schools issue is. We're going to receive a new school, the town of Yarmouth, on December the 5th. When schools are deemed surplus, they go back to the owner. In some cases, like the junior high, the owner is the province of Nova Scotia, so we're clear of that one. But in the case of the high school, we're the owner on the deed, so they'll turn that facility back to us with not a penny. Now, the policy I recommend, or I'm recommending that be mirrored, is the one for health continuing care facilities. So when Titleview Manor was deemed surplus, there was a process and a policy that was followed that they had 6 months to determine whether they want to keep it and sell it, or have the province pay for demolition. So I think the same ought to be true for schools, is that municipalities ought to have the opportunity to be off the hook for the cost of demolition, if that is ultimately what belongs, what is appropriate. In the case of schools that are in better condition, where there might be viable reuse possibilities, we ought to have 6 months to figure that out. And 6 months, then you have to make a decision. In the case of Titleview, it wasn't clear in 6 months, and in fact the province did provide an extension on that, and we have a happy ending. The property was sold to the private sector. There's a development application right now in that facility, and hopefully a tax-generating business creating jobs in the community in the not-too-distant future.
Oh, sorry.
Just a quick question. We had at the UNSM, we had a recommendation, a proposal for this, what you just talked about, and that kind of fits into line, and that did pass. So hopefully they'll look at that when this comes. Somebody will marry them both together, hopefully, and it's basically the same thing. So, but it's a little different here because all towns municipal units will adapt to it. So,
Yeah.
and that's good.
I recommend you consider the elimination of corrections and housing mandatory contributions from municipalities in keeping with the Fair and Equitable Funding Report of 2005 and the canceled MOU with the province. So again, this would be funded through the phase-out of equalization. Go back to those mandatory expenditures, the transfers for the town of Yarmouth, that's about $300,000 total that we give to the province for corrections and housing, that they would cancel that transfer and we would retain those property taxes for providing the services that we actually provide. Any questions on that? Memorandum of Understanding. And so to explain that, after the Fair and Equitable Funding came out, funding report came out in 2005, the government of the day agreed to freeze contributions to education and to phase out contributions for corrections and housing. See, the province creates municipalities and has the authority over municipalities. They can do what they wish. That's their prerogative. However, the UNSM negotiated a memorandum of understanding. It wasn't an agreement, right? But it was a memorandum of understanding for what the province would do in the future, which was the phasing out of these mandatory contributions. They canceled that on the basis of fiscal concerns, and so we now we're back to paying the full amount for housing and corrections. So MOU is just a memorandum of understanding, and that's probably the best that UNSM can get on your behalf, because they are not technically, they're not required to pay these costs. They're just representing you at the table.
Thank you, Your Worship. Now, we all know to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. If we eliminate corrections and housing, we don't pay into that anymore. We're going to feel that in some way or another. How?
So what I was suggesting is this is in the context of recommendation 16, which was about equalization. So I'm recommending equalization be phased out. Okay? So they will no longer give us money for equalization. What I'm saying here is we'll no longer give them money for corrections and housing. So it becomes, again, a zero-sum scenario.
They're going to come through another door, though, for us.
Well, they could always do that. I mean, the province can always saddle you, download additional responsibilities. But what we're hoping to achieve here, realistically, is to ratchet things back a bit, so that we're more viable, so the relationships are more fair and equitable. And you know, you're absolutely right. In the future, there will be new issues that emerge, and there will be new attempts, or maybe successful attempts, to download costs onto municipalities. UNSM, on your behalf, you know, communicates with the province and has an understanding currently that no new transfers of cost will occur without a year's notice. So at least you can prepare, and you can lobby and you know, politic around it. Okay. So recommendation 17 was noting concerns over CBRM's viability and noting that many options for improving viability available to most of the other municipalities in Nova Scotia, such as shared services and structural change, are not realistic options for CBRM. It is recommended that the municipality and the province conduct an immediate joint review to assess the viability issues facing CBRM. This review will make recommendations on how to best address the specific issues facing CBRM, including recommendations on appropriate provincial grants for the municipality. Special case. So my response to this is, first of all, an observation, is they were amalgamated 20 years ago, and clearly restructuring did not solve root causes of their issues. This sounds a lot like the tailored public policy process that was spoke about in recommendation 12. And so it's important that they study it and learn from it, because ultimately if let's say that we have a bunch of regional municipalities at some point in the near future, all we've done is change structure and not addressed root causes of problems, You know, Yarmouth County or Shelburne County or, you know, Guysborough County could be the next CBRM 20 years down. So you're just kicking the problem further down the road as opposed to addressing it. So all I'm saying in response to this is if the province were going to do this, we need to pay real close attention and make sure there's some lessons learned that the rest of us can benefit from, so we don't make the same mistakes again, which is ignoring root causes of the issues. Recommendation 18 was, now remember, they recommended freezing equalization, so they're saying during that freeze period, the $30 million would be funded through $30 million funded through equalization would be funded by the province. Right now, some of that comes from some of that comes from a grant that the province receives from Nova Scotia Power. We're going to get into that. On equalization alone, I'm not recommending that you favor the freeze option. I'm suggesting we go to a phase out and start using the money now for other things such as surplus schools and eliminating mandatory contributions. We generally support increased provincial investment in the success of municipalities. So this recommendation is code for more provincial money. And what we're saying is we support a greater investment by the province in municipalities, not necessarily the way they've proposed it. Okay. The NSPI grant should be calculated based on rates times assessment for host municipalities, where one standard rate is determined for the entire province. This recommendation will not impact the payment that NSPI makes to the province. Indeed, NSPI will continue to make payments as per existing legislation. This recommendation only impacts how those monies are allocated among municipalities. Additionally, at no time will the value of this grant exceed the value of the payment in lieu of taxes that NSPI makes to the province. So right now, Nova Scotia Power has special legislation which dictates that they transfer a grant to the province. Okay, so they don't pay property taxes anywhere. So the Nova Scotia Power depot out on Pleasant Street, no taxes. All of the easements Nova Scotia Power has throughout the province, all of the lands that they own, no taxes whatsoever. This recommendation is saying, currently, when you have an asset, a Nova Scotia Power asset that generates power, you get part of a grant in lieu of taxes paid to you. So, Town of Annapolis Royal has that tidal generating station within their boundaries. They get a significant transfer from the province, from NSPI, because they generate electricity within their boundaries. So it is only those municipalities that have power generating stations of one form or another in their municipalities that are owned by Nova Scotia Power receive anything. This recommendation is saying give them a full, although it was assessment times tax rate, pay them a full amount rather than a partial amount, which is currently the case. So my response to this is that even if you did that, it isn't going to be fair, because every municipality has lands that belong to Nova Scotia Power, and only those that are generating electricity right now are receiving a grant. So giving them more doesn't make the situation more fair. In fact, it skews it even further. So we're saying rather than giving those municipalities a full grant in lieu of taxes on their properties, why not look at some other unfair situations that exist, such as properties NSPI owns that have no grant in lieu, or provincial properties with no grant in lieu of taxes that demand services and infrastructure.
I'm sorry, again, what's the G stand for?
Grant in lieu of taxes. Sorry, in the previous slide it was PILT, which was a payment in lieu. So I tend to use grant in lieu, and in the recommendation they use payment in lieu. In any case, what I'm suggesting is rather than making the power generating resources, give them a full taxation, Why not give municipalities that host either schools or hospitals a grant in lieu of taxes? Not full taxation, but something. We know that having a school within your boundaries affects your service levels. It affects your infrastructure. You need sidewalks. You need to plow those streets. You need to plow those sidewalks. Right? You need to have, some have crossing guards. You need to have crosswalks. Right? Having a school within your boundaries affects your infrastructure and your services. Having a hospital does as well. Right? Our hospital requires that we need to pay particular attention, as we learned a couple of years ago, on the water side. It is critical for dialysis, of course, that they have water. We provide that water. So being able to provide that water, being able to provide safe streets for ambulances to travel on, those bits of infrastructure currently we get no compensation for. So what I'm saying is, rather than fully compensate those with electrical generating stations, why not partially compensate them, but also partially compensate others? I would have gone, if I was putting on my town hat, I'd have said hospitals alone. Because I think most, if not all, the hospitals are within towns, right? But there's also the schools. And I guess that's a question for you guys, if you want to look at this recommendation and make it just hospitals, or just schools, or schools and hospitals, or throw the whole thing out. I'm a little torn on it, because the reason I'm torn is I want to look at this fairly, but I'm also looking at it through a particular lens. And so going with the hospital recommendation absolutely does, it favors towns more. Yes. We spend a lot on infrastructure, and we've spent a lot in the last couple of years that are related to those types of assets within our boundaries. When a school goes in a rural municipality, the sidewalks, and I'm not sure that the rural municipality has to pay for the sidewalks. Certainly they don't pay for road improvements, because those are provincial. So you could make an argument that, and in fact the services are provincial as well. So you can make an argument that the hospitals is the better example.
In your response to number 19, schools and hospitals, it's in your draft to us, it's just schools. So,
Yeah, I've been back and forth on that one.
okay, but I would agree with you or support you on schools and hospitals.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
What would the difference be if we included both of them? Can you explain? You said you were torn between
Yeah.
one or two.
Yeah.
Could we look at both, because both are very important? And if we choose both, is that taken from one?
Okay, so the way I guess the reason I was torn and is this, is schools, from what I thinking about this one, I could envision how schools put more of a demand on services and infrastructure than I could hospitals. Schools are in municipalities as well as towns. When they're in municipalities, those service burdens largely are on the province. So giving a rural municipality a grant in lieu of taxes, when we're talking about the extra burden being things like snow plowing and keeping the infrastructure up, they don't pay for that. So hospitals might be the better example, because where hospitals exist is largely in towns, and the towns pay those costs. That might make more sense. It's just a little bit more difficult when you think about what kind of demands does the hospital put on us as a town. It's not as clear as what schools put on us.
Okay.
But it's certainly, there are a lot of people that come into the town to access the hospital, not just from the town, but from the region, right? It is a regional hospital. And so the people who pay for the roads and the snow clearing and so on to make it safe to get to the hospital are your town residents on those roads. And outside, it's provincial.
We just happen to have both. Do you think I'm not asking you to, I guess I am asking you, do you think they'd look favorably on supporting both or one? If you were sitting where they're sitting, what would your recommendation be?
If I was sitting where who was
Where the
sitting?
province is sitting, looking at this and said, okay, maybe we can do one, maybe we can do both.
Am I sitting there as a provincial
Yeah.
bureaucrat, or am
Yeah.
I sitting there as a provincial politician?
A politician.
The politician might say, let's go with schools because we keep everybody happy.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Okay.
Thank you.
The, from my perspective, I think when you get right down to it, hospitals is probably the better, less saleable, but better place to put the money. And that's where I got torn there is, and I'm not a politician, but I know that all of these responses, that no group of politicians is likely to take all of these responses and say, that's exactly what we're going to do. Because there's a lot of friction will be created when, if people thought that all these things were going to happen. But that friction might be worth it if it fixed a long-term problem for the long term. I'm not sure it will, but it'll make it better.
Just another comment. One of the earlier recommendations is that we ask that the rurals pay for roads maintenance, so that's where you get back to the schools part.
Yeah, and that's a fair comment. If the province were to accept the recommendation on roads, then schools would be more appropriate. So, fair comment. So, that's just the recommendation there. Or the response, I should say. So recommendation 20 was that the province would eliminate the HST offset program as there's no sound policy rationale for the program. And I just commented on this, that what they're talking about here is a grant that is funded by Nova Scotia Power. The grant total is $6 million, and it's spread out to municipalities, $6 million. And it's spread among all the municipalities based on how much HST you paid 2 years ago. I think it was introduced as kind of a measure to take some of the sting out of the HST. But really there's no strong policy rationale for it. And I think we should support that recommendation so long as the $6 million gets allocated in some other way, whether it's an incentive program or a grant in lieu of taxes, what have you. Not just a cash windfall for another level of government.
Agreed.
Recommendation 21. The province will create a program or suite of programs dedicated to promoting innovation and capacity building activities for municipalities, including the comprehensive municipal reviews recommended by the committee. To fund these activities, the province should allocate $1.5 million of the Nova Scotia Power payment in lieu of taxes to the $250,000 that is currently budgeted for municipal capacity building programs. Okay. We support the creation of the Innovation Fund, and we think it should be funded through the phasing out of equalization as opposed to the reallocation of the Nova Scotia Power money. And that actually this reflects an example of the incentive-based program that we talked about in an earlier recommendation. So support it, just don't agree with how it would be funded. Recommendation 22, PCAP. So PCAP is the Provincial Capital Assistance Program. So the province has a small pot of money, and I think it's in the area of $4 million currently, that the minister can use to contribute to capital programs in municipalities. So we've accessed PCAP on renovations we've done to the fire hall. We've accessed it on improvements we've done to the wastewater plant. And we may have accessed it on the Milton Dam. I don't recall specifically. So we've accessed this program in the past. So their recommendation is that PCAP should be expanded by $14.2 million which would be equal to, under their recommendations, the balance of the Nova Scotia Power payment in lieu of taxes monies, and that the PCAP program should be broadened to include roads and other capital projects deemed critical by municipalities. It is intended that in the initial years of this program expansion, some monies should be used to develop an asset management program for all municipalities outside the HRM. So a response is that investment in capital is important to tackling the infrastructure deficit. There's no question on that. And we support an asset management approach. And we think if there's some provincial work around that, we think that's a great thing. Most municipalities are still digging the hole deeper while looking for assistance from above. And what I mean by that is they're not funding their amortization. They're not keeping up with their capital use and still requesting funding from above. So we think that funding of amortization of your tangible capital assets is an important policy matter and should be part of the formula if there's going to be a capital assistance program. We think there ought to be a transfer rather than an application program, and that the asset base and funding of amortization as criteria. So the actual recommendation would read like this. We recommend the province develop and implement a capital assistance transfer to municipalities that would take into account their asset base and the degree to which municipalities are funding their amortization. The transfer would operate similar to the federal gas tax. This is not precedent setting. This exists in some other provinces. So it's not an application. It's that every year, based on what is your asset base, your fixed assets, your capital assets, and to what degree are you funding your use of those capital assets, you would be eligible for a transfer of funds from the province similar to the gas tax. Recommendation 23. The province will provide a provincial grant for arterial and collector roads once a comprehensive inventory is developed. The grant will be allocated at a rate of $9,000 per kilometre of arterial and collector roads within the municipality's boundaries. This is approximately the difference between the average maintenance costs that towns pay for roads and TIR's cost. So what that said is that within the town of Yarmouth, they would give us a grant of $9,000 per kilometre for Main Street, for Haley Road, for Stars Road, and for Vancouver Street. Okay? So I looked at a map Linda had on her desk a few weeks ago, and it was a map from the 1940s. And it had colored in red, it's probably still on her desk, it had colored in red those same roads. And the reason they were colored in red is that somebody was showing a council of the day that the province was no longer going to provide funding for the maintenance of those roads. So this recommendation is actually a reversal of a decision of, what is that, 70 years ago? Not sure that that is the best way to tackle the roads equity issue. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not. And it's just too little. It's too little to make a difference. So the recommendation on that is, the response on that basically is too little. It doesn't do the job, and refer back to our earlier roads recommendations. Opportunities to improve revenue systems. Recommendations 24, 25, and 26. All on this page and all supported. Property tax should continue to be the primary source of revenue for municipalities. They did a deep dive into alternatives, and I recommend we support the property tax continue.
Thank you.
The province should amend legislation to provide greater municipal autonomy over property taxation of forest and recreational property. That primarily affects rural municipalities. And a full review of the exempt agricultural property should be conducted to determine if the benefit of the tax reduction is going to those who are actively farming. Sounds like a good idea. Recommendation 27. The province and its municipal partners review the finance powers provided in the Municipal Government Act and the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter to provide municipalities with broader authority to establish fair and effective property taxation and revenue regimes. There's a lot that's not said in that recommendation, and one of them is that it would allow municipalities to reduce taxes. Right now, you can increase taxes with area rates. Part of what is being contemplated behind this is that you'd be able to provide lower tax rates in certain circumstances. So property taxes fund our municipal services, and certainly lower taxes are for all is a good thing. Power to compete on taxes for specific projects is a very risky proposition, and so imagine for a moment that a large corporation, let's just for sake of argument, Michelin, came to Yarmouth and, just something you can wrap your head around, came to Yarmouth and said, we're interested in setting up a plant, and we're looking at property on whatever street in town, but your tax rates are a bit high. A council would be under a huge amount of pressure to reduce, for that particular business, your tax rates, because it means jobs and it means development. But in the long term, you're slitting your own throat, right? Because every business is important. Every resident is important. And how do you say no? How do you say no to one business when they come in? What's your basis? So what I'm saying is the ability to lower taxes is good for all, right? Lower taxes are good for all, but the ability to selectively reduce taxes for enticing businesses or industries is a very risky proposition. So parameters and oversight are required. Okay? So I'm not saying don't give us the ability to do it, but if you're going to give us the ability to slit our own throats, be very careful what you do.
Yeah.
And the powers must be distributed evenly. I noticed in the Chronicle Herald a week or two ago that the province actually gave HRM the ability to lower taxation for a specific industrial property. And so there's an inequity there. I don't know the situation. It's hard to comment on because I'm not informed on that. But there's an example where HRM on a specific instance got an authority that nobody else has. If that is the way forward, then it's everyone for themselves. I guess you try and get the province to help you out to attract a business or industry by giving you legislative authority to lower taxes for a particular property. Again, don't know the situation, just need to be very, very careful about how you move forward on something like this.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It looks better angle from over here. What about, Jeff, so you talked about that part. What about the laddering or the, so you go fix up a property, do a commercial property, then you say, you buy the old courthouse across the street, you put $5 million into it, you make it, an $8 million property. Yeah, what about in the town's task force, there was recommendation to ladder or to step back the tax process where you might not charge them a full amount of tax the first year and then, could introduce it over 5 years or 10 years. How's that?
I have no real issue with that. It does delay the benefit to the general taxpayer, but it probably makes it easier for a business or whatnot to consider making those improvements because you start to get a payback on your investment before you start paying the extra taxes. No issue on that because you're not actually reducing the taxation, you're just deferring it. And you will receive it in the long term, and it's long-term viability I'm most concerned with.
Plus, the other thing, you're still going to receive what you were receiving in the first place,
Absolutely.
and then the increase is going to be, okay.
Yeah, I have no issue with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
So a couple of blue points here that I want to throw out to you. And these are more for discussion and maybe to run me out of the room. I wondered to myself about tax equity or tax parity between municipal units and whether or not there ought to be, if this stuff was accepted in its entirety, then it would solve some problems for sure. In the absence of that, though, mandating ratios, not rations. Within municipalities, what's the ratio of your commercial rate to your residential rate? Or between municipalities, what's the ratio between the town rate and the adjacent municipality rate? Just thinking about that a little bit. But I had an even crazier thought than that. And the mayor put me onto this one at the last PAC when she asked the question, what do you pay your taxes for? Like, why do I pay this much in taxes? And in towns, you pay it because you see the streets and the sidewalks and the recreation and whatnot. In the rurals, you pay it because you have the open space, the larger lots, the privacy, the less traffic, right? Where you live should be based on what you value, not necessarily how much you pay, right? Those things that rural dwellers enjoy are still serviced by their municipalities. And there's no rationale why towns need to be taxed higher than rurals necessarily. So if you are one municipality, and this has never happened in the province of Nova Scotia, by the way, in the four amalgamations we've had, I shouldn't say that. I don't know the Canso situation. The other three that have been out there for 20 years, the residential tax rates in the former town areas are different than the former rural areas. So even in Queens County, the residential tax rate in the former town of Liverpool, is twice what it is in the former municipality of Queens. They don't have the same tax rate, but everybody is receiving a level of service. Everybody benefits from the former town of Liverpool's infrastructure and its services. Everybody benefits by the green spaces and the beauty of Queens County, but they pay two different tax rates. And you pay more based on what you value, right? And so maybe one tax rate makes sense. And so I thought about income tax as an example. Income tax, doesn't matter where you live, you're taxed on your income. There are different brackets for sure, and I'm not sure how many brackets there are today. But in Nova Scotia on property tax, there are 54 brackets. 54 municipalities all set their own tax rates. And if you want to go further, there's 108 brackets. Yeah, I know. So I guess just want to throw out there the idea that right now we're used to a status quo. The conventional wisdom is the tax rates in towns are higher than tax rates in rurals. I don't think that there's actually, I don't think that is a must be. I think that is just our habit. It's the way things have evolved.
Yeah, and that's a whole paradigm shift and a difficult one to tackle.
Yeah, it's in blue.
Yeah, so the conversation, what you were saying when I had brought it up, it was a conversation with the mayor in Alberta, and they had amalgamated, and I said, how did you deal with that tax issue? And she said, well, it's what you said. It's in the municipality, you pay because you have wide open space and fresh air and all that stuff. In the town, you pay for different reasons. So she said, you choose where you live. Taxes shouldn't be that much different. They certainly are a lot different here.
Well, assessment is the other part of the equation.
Yeah.
Right? And so your taxes would not be equal necessarily. I mean, the value of your property is still going to change depending on, the services and your situation. So it's just there for discussion. But I really think, when you think about amalgamations and Queens County being the model of success, they still have the tax rate issue 20 years later. And wouldn't it be a better scenario long-term for the viability of municipalities if we could agree to a different way of thinking about property taxes, the same way we think about income taxes, the same way we think about sales taxes. Everybody pays the same rate.
Councillor Dodd?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm sure this is not a new question, and I'm sure it's been asked many times. To your knowledge, do you know how the answers what the answers have been and how the differences have been justified?
Well, I think that the differences have probably been justified based on the visible services, right? So you'd say, well, you have sidewalks, or you have transit, or you have those services. You think about what your provincial taxes pay, your income tax and your HST. I just made a quick list this morning of the things that those taxes pay for: roads, education, community services, policing, emergency services, health, tourism, parks, all things that your property tax pays for too. Right? So that's a quick list off the top of my head. Your provincial taxes, we accept that everybody pays the same rate. And it's paying for those sorts of things, mostly education and health. Well, we're paying a couple $1 million in education out of your property taxes. We're paying for doctor recruitment and clinic operations out of your property taxes, right? Everything on that list we pay for as well. And yet there's this conventional wisdom that property taxes can't be equal across municipal boundaries. And I'm just suggesting to you that there is another point of view for another day, perhaps.
Good?
We're done for today?
Are we good for today? There's all, yeah. It's the hours he's put in.